Maple Resolve, The Great Canadian Counter, by Irwin Montrose. Chapter 1. The Call to Action. The frigid air of early February in Ottawa gnawed Emily Tran's cheeks as she stepped outside her apartment, her breath forming little clouds in the pale morning light. The sun had just begun to rise over Parliament Hill, casting a golden glow over the city that did little to warm the growing unease in her gut. Canada was under siege, not from tanks or soldiers, but from the relentless economic and political assault of a US administration hell-bent on reshaping the world order in its favor. President Donald Trump had always made it clear, America first, always. But now, it was America only. The latest tariffs had landed like a hammer on Canada's economy. Lumber, steel, agriculture, industries that had kept the country's heartbeat steady for generations, were suddenly teetering. Businesses shut down overnight. Workers protested in the streets. The stock market plunged. Even the ever-polite Canadians were starting to lose their patience. And then came the unthinkable. The night before, a leaked memo from Washington had hit the news. The White House was entertaining the possibility of administrative reorganization with Canada, an unprecedented push to integrate its economy and governance into the United States. In layman's terms, Trump wanted Canada to become the 51st state. The announcement sent shockwaves through the country. Some Americans cheered. The far-right media was calling it a merger of destiny, a return of the prodigal nation. Others in the US were more hesitant, questioning the legality, the ethics, and the sheer absurdity of the claim. But the worst reaction of all? Some Canadians actually supported the idea. That was the part that made Emily's stomach churn. She had spent years studying global economics, dissecting the power structures that dictated the fate of nations. She knew one thing above all else: sovereignty wasn't lost in a single stroke. It was eroded, piece by piece, until one day people simply woke up and realized they had none left. She refused to let that happen.
A meeting in Winnipeg. Noah Whitefeather had seen many fights in his time. As an Indigenous leader from Saskatchewan, he had spent most of his life battling for the rights of his people, fighting land disputes, corporate encroachment, and government policies that paid lip service to reconciliation while still gutting Indigenous autonomy. But this was different. When the tariffs hit, it wasn't just businesses that suffered. Indigenous communities, already marginalized, felt the impact in brutal ways. Supply chains broke down, making it harder for people to get basic goods. Resource projects collapsed, cutting off essential income. The cultural industries tied to wood, textiles, and tourism suffered heavy blows. Now, with Washington's ambitions creeping further north, Noah saw history repeating itself. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was colonization all over again. So when Emily Tran called him, saying she had an idea, a big one, he listened. And when she told him to meet her in Winnipeg, he didn't hesitate.
The coffee shop they met in was a tiny place, nestled between a bookstore and a thrift shop in downtown Winnipeg. The kind of spot where university students scribbled notes, where retired folks read the paper, and where revolutionaries whispered plans over steaming cups of dark roast. Emily sat at the back, flipping through a notebook filled with scrawled ideas. When Noah slid into the seat across from her, she barely looked up.
"You're late," she muttered. "There's no traffic in Winnipeg," she said, finally looking at him.
He smirked. Fine, I was getting a Bannock burger.
Emily shook her head but smiled. "At least you have your priorities straight."
Noah leaned back, stretching his arms. All right, Tran, you dragged me here. Give me the pitch.
Emily took a deep breath. "The U.S. isn't just coming after our economy," she said. "They're coming after us. They're laying the groundwork, getting the right people on their side. If we don't fight back now, they'll divide us before we even realize what's happening."
Noah nodded slowly. He arched a brow. What are you suggesting?
"A movement," she said. "Something massive, something unstoppable." She slid a napkin across the table, words scrawled across it in dark ink.
Resolve.
Noah studied the name, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. And what exactly does Maple Resolve do?
Emily leaned in. "We mobilize, we innovate, we build an economy so strong that the U.S. can't dictate terms anymore. We make Canada the leader in green energy, tech, and sustainable industry. We create a cultural resurgence so loud that no one forgets who we are."
He let out a low whistle. That's a hell of a vision.
"We have no choice," she said. This is a fight for survival.
Noah was silent for a moment. Then, with a slow nod, he extended his hand.
All right, he said, let's build this thing.
Emily shook his hand, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest.
Maple Resolve had just been born.
Chapter 2. The movement takes form. A movement was only as strong as the people who carried it. Emily and Noah knew this instinctively. They had the spark, but without fuel, Maple Resolve was nothing more than an idea scribbled on a napkin. If they wanted to turn it into a wildfire, they needed people, all kinds of people. The night after their meeting in Winnipeg, Emily barely slept. Instead, she was on the phone, tapping into every contact she had. Former professors, economists, business owners, environmentalists, even old university friends working in government think tanks. Noah, meanwhile, was doing the same, but his approach was different. He wasn't calling bureaucrats. He was reaching out to grassroots activists, Indigenous leaders, artists, and local organizers. He knew that the real power of a movement came from those who had been fighting for justice long before the current crisis hit. By the time the sun rose, they had their first war council. Toronto, the first gathering. They decided to meet in Toronto, the heart of Canada's financial sector, because if they were going to shake the system, they needed to rattle it at its core. It was a cold, rainy afternoon when a small but powerful group gathered in an old community centre in Kensington Market. The room smelled of coffee, damp jackets, and anticipation. Emily stood at the front, her laptop open, notes scattered on the table beside her. Noah leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening intently. Around the room, a mix of faces stared back at them, some skeptical, some excited, all waiting to hear why they'd been summoned. Among them was Dr. Hannah McCall, a leading researcher in renewable energy and one of the fiercest critics of Canada's reliance on fossil fuels. Omar Aziz, a tech entrepreneur who had recently turned down a lucrative US investment to keep his AI startup in Canada. Sophie Tremblay, a union leader from Quebec, representing thousands of manufacturing workers who had been hit hardest by Trump's tariffs. Kenny Lee, a documentary filmmaker who had made a name for himself exposing corporate corruption. Chief Daniel Crowchild, an influential Indigenous leader from Alberta who had fought for years against pipelines that threatened sacred lands. Marie Boudreau, a lobster fisher from Nova Scotia, whose business had been strangled by export restrictions.
Emily took a deep breath. We're here because we all see what's happening. The U.S. isn't just pressuring Canada, they're redefining it. If we don't take control of our own future, someone else will.
She clicked a button on her laptop. The projector hummed to life, displaying a simple but powerful image on the wall, a Canadian flag, but with 51 stars on the US banner. The room went dead silent. Sophie swore under her breath. Marie muttered something in French. Kenny snapped a photo of the image on his phone.
This isn't a conspiracy theory, Emily continued. They've already started. Economic destabilization, media manipulation, even political infiltration. The longer we wait, the weaker we get.
Omar leaned forward. So what's the plan?
Noah spoke up for the first time.
We build, we resist, we innovate. Maple Resolve isn't just about fighting back. It's about proving we don't need the U.S. to thrive. We outgrow their influence before they can tighten the leash.
Dr. McCall nodded.
Green tech. If we get serious about it, we could lead the world instead of playing catch-up.
Sophie frowned.
Easier said than done. The corporations don't want that, and the government's in bed with them.
Then we bypass them, Emily said. Start small. Build community-driven industries, energy co-ops, worker-owned manufacturing, decentralized tech.
Chief Crowchild tapped his fingers against the table.
And culture. You can't just fight with economics. You need identity. If people don't feel like they're losing something worth fighting for, they won't fight at all.
The room buzzed with new ideas, arguments, excitement. After 2 hours, they had their first real plan. A national buy local campaign, mobilizing small businesses, farmers, and manufacturers to create an economy that didn't depend on US imports. Investment in clean energy startups. Dr. McCall and Omar would spearhead initiatives to fund alternative energy projects. A cultural resurgence. Kenny and Chief Crowchild would launch a national documentary series, exposing the impact of US influence and celebrating Canadian heritage. Public demonstrations. Sophie and Noah would organize rallies and protests, starting with a massive one in Toronto. By the time the meeting ended, there was no more skepticism. There was only resolve. Maple Resolve had just gone from an idea to a movement. The first protest, Toronto takes a stand. 3 weeks later, the first real test arrived. Toronto was no stranger to protests, but this one felt different. It began in Nathan Phillips Square in front of City Hall. A cold wind whipped through the crowd, but no one left. The turnout was bigger than expected, over 10,000 people, packed shoulder to shoulder. Some carried banners with slogans like, "Canada is not for sale." 51 stars, not today. Maple Resolve equals Canadian strength. On stage, Emily stepped up to the microphone, her breath visible in the crisp air. 3 months ago, no one thought Canada was at risk. They told us this was just politics, just trade, just business. But we see what's happening. And we're saying, the crowd roared in unison. No, Noah took the mic next.
They want us to feel small, like we're just America's little brother lucky to be next door. But we built this country, we fought for it, and we won't let anyone take it from us.
More cheers. And then sirens. Emily stiffened.
Oh, help.
The police had arrived. And not just a few officers. Riot gear, barricades, the whole show. From the edge of the crowd, a line of counter-protesters emerged. They carried US flags and signs reading, "Join America, be great again." Some were Canadians who had bought into the propaganda. Others, Emily suspected, weren't even Canadian at all. Things were about to get messy. Chapter 3. The resistance faces its first test. The first sign that things were about to go south came when the counter-protesters moved closer. Emily could see them from the stage, their US flags waving high, their red Make America Great Again hats scattered through the crowd like bloodstains in a sea of resistance. Some of them were just shouting slogans. Others carried signs with messages that made her stomach turn. Canada is weak. Join America. The 51st star is your future. Trudeau equals a cuck for Biden. And then there were the ones who weren't carrying signs at all. The ones who looked like they were here for a fight. Emily barely had time to process it before a bottle flew through the air, smashing against the pavement just a few feet from the stage. Shit. The crowd rippled with tension. Protesters turned toward the agitators, shouts rising. Somewhere in the back, a scuffle broke out. A young woman, holding a Canada Stand Strong sign, was shoved, and someone punched the guy who did it. More bottles flew. The police, who had been standing at the edges, suddenly surged forward in full riot gear. And then it was chaos.
Everyone, stay calm, Emily shouted into the mic. Do not engage.
Too late. The line between protester and counter-protester had already dissolved into a frenzy of pushing, swinging, screaming bodies. Cops waded into the mess, grabbing whoever they could. Emily turned to Noah.
We need to...
But he was already gone, jumping down from the stage and running straight into the thick of it. She lost sight of him for a full minute, panic clawing at her throat. When she finally spotted him again, he was in the middle of the clash, trying to pull a young Indigenous protester away from a group of masked agitators. One of them, big, bald, and looking way too comfortable in this chaos, shoved Noah hard. Noah didn't shove back. Instead, he raised both hands, speaking slowly. "We don't need to do this, man." The guy sneered. "You already lost." Then he sucker-punched Noah in the gut. Emily's breath caught as Noah doubled over. Before he could recover, 2 cops grabbed him from behind, dragging him back. "Hey!" Emily jumped off the stage, shoving through the crowd. "He didn't do anything." The officer closest to her, middle-aged, grim-faced, barely glanced at her. "He's coming with us." "For what?" The cop didn't answer. And just like that, Noah was thrown into the back of a police van, the door slamming shut behind him. Emily's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just a protest gone wrong. This was a message. The movement had just been declared a threat. The media storm, Noah's arrest, exploded across the country within hours. By the time Emily made it back to her apartment that night, Maple Resolve was the top story on every major news channel. She sat on her couch, her laptop open, her phone buzzing non-stop. CBC News. Violence erupts at Toronto protest. Activist Noah Whitefeather arrested. CTV. Maple Resolve leader in custody after clashes at City Hall. Fox News US. Radical Canadian separatists disrupt peaceful pro-unity rally. Emily clenched her jaw. Separatists? That was the spin they were going with? Her phone rang again. It was Sophie Tremblay, the union leader from Quebec. "Please tell me you have a plan," Sophie said without preamble. Emily exhaled sharply. We need to get him out. Immediately. Already working on that, Sophie said. But it's bigger than Noah now. The second they put cuffs on him, he became a symbol. Emily knew she was right. People were already calling for action. Protests were planned in multiple cities. Social media was flooded with #free Noah posts. But there was something else. Something more dangerous. A message from an anonymous account had just landed in her inbox. Be careful. They're watching you. A warning from the inside. The meeting was set for midnight in a parking garage downtown. Emily wasn't sure why she agreed to it. Maybe she was just desperate for answers. Maybe she had some deep, reckless urge to find out just how much danger they were really in. Either way, she found herself sitting behind the wheel of her car, watching the entrance, waiting. The figure appeared a few minutes later, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim glow of the overhead lights. A man, mid-50s, suit and tie slightly disheveled, government type. Emily opened her door and stepped out.
The man glanced around before speaking. Miss Tran?
She folded her arms. That depends on who's asking.
A humorless smile. Call me Daniel.
All right, Daniel. Why the hell did you drag me out here?
He exhaled slowly. To tell you that you're in over your head.
Emily arched a brow. That's supposed to scare me?
No, he said, it's supposed to warn you.
She studied him. You're government, aren't you?
Daniel hesitated.
So what? You're a rogue agent with a conscience.
Something flickered in his expression. Let's just say I don't like what I'm seeing. And what are you seeing? Daniel took a step closer.
The United States has been planning this for years. The tariffs, the economic pressure, it was never just about trade, it was about control.
Emily's breath hitched. You're saying...
I'm saying that Washington isn't just hoping Canada folds. They're making sure of it. And they're using every tool they have, economic warfare, political coercion, and if necessary, force.
A chill ran down Emily's spine. Daniel lowered his voice. The people backing this aren't just some random bureaucrats in DC. We're talking private interests, corporations, media conglomerates. Even some Canadian politicians are in on it. Emily swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this?
Because you still have a chance to stop it, he said. But you need to be smart. You need to be careful.
She stared at him, pulse pounding. What happens if we don't stop it?
Daniel's face darkened. Then Canada becomes America's next conquest.
Chapter 4. The war escalates. The next morning, the official statement from the government hit the airwaves. While we support the right to peaceful protest, we cannot condone violence or unlawful assembly. Mr. Noah Whitefeather has been released, but he will face charges related to inciting unrest. We urge Canadians to remain calm and trust in our institutions. Emily nearly threw her phone at the wall. It was the perfect political play. Release Noah, but make sure he was branded a criminal. The message was clear. Resist, and you'll pay the price. The media ran with it. Canadian conservative outlets echoed government talking points, calling Maple Resolve a radical organization. But the real damage was coming from south of the border. On Fox News, a panel of smug pundits debated whether Canada was too unstable to govern itself. I mean, look at the footage, one of them scoffed. You've got protests turning into riots, economic collapse, people losing jobs left and right. At some point, don't you have to ask, would Canada be better off as part of the United States? Another pundit smirked. Well, some Canadians already seem to think so. The screen cut to clips of the counter-protesters waving US flags in Toronto, carefully edited to make it look like they had been the peaceful ones. Emily exhaled sharply. The propaganda war had begun. Noah's homecoming. Noah Whitefeather was no stranger to police stations, but this time, when they let him go, things were different. He barely stepped outside before a wave of reporters closed in, microphones shoved in his face. Mr. Whitefeather, do you take responsibility for the violence at the protest? Are you a criminal? Will you denounce Maple Resolve? Noah ignored them. His cousin, Jesse, was waiting at the curb with his truck running. Get in, Jesse muttered. As soon as Noah climbed inside, Jesse peeled away from the curb. The reporters swarmed in frustration behind them. I hope you realize you just became the most famous Indigenous man in Canada, Jesse said dryly as they drove.
Noah sighed, rubbing his temples. Yeah, well, I'd rather be famous for something other than getting arrested.
Jesse smirked. Too late. They pulled onto the highway, heading out of the city. You're not going back to your place, Jesse said. Too risky.
Noah frowned. What do you mean?
Jesse hesitated. Then he reached into his jacket and handed Noah a phone.
Emily sent this, it's bad.
Noah took the phone, pressing play on the video. It was a news segment, an American one. New leaks from US intelligence suggest that radical Canadian separatists, including indigenous extremists, are fueling violent resistance to North American unity efforts. Noah's grip tightened on the phone. Sources indicate that Maple Resolve has ties to foreign interests, possibly even China, seeking to undermine stability in the region. He turned to Jesse, his jaw clenched. Jesse nodded grimly. Noah exhaled slowly.
We need to hit back fast.
A digital battlefield. Emily was already working on that. She sat in a dimly lit office in Montreal, staring at the screen in front of her. Noah's arrest had put them in the crosshairs. The government was coming down on them, the media was smearing them, and now their systems were under attack. A Maple Resolve website had been hacked that morning, defaced with American flags and messages calling them traitors. Their social media accounts were flooded with thousands of bot-driven comments, all spreading the same narrative. Canada is failing. America can save you. And then, the worst part. Emily's inbox was flooded with threats. Some were the usual garbage, racist slurs, death threats from anonymous trolls. But some were too specific. They mentioned where she lived, where she worked, her parents' address in Vancouver. She felt sick. This wasn't just internet hate. This was intimidation.
Are we compromised? She asked Omar Aziz, who was sitting across from her, furiously typing away at his laptop.
Not yet, Omar muttered. But it's close. They're trying to trace our network, shut down our servers. We need to move fast.
Emily swallowed hard. Can you stop them?
Omar smirked.
I can do better than that. He cracked his knuckles. They want to play dirty? He muttered. Let's show them how Canadian hackers do it.
Diplomacy or defiance? That night, Emily got another message from Daniel, the mysterious government insider who had warned her before. This time, it was a simple text. Meet me. Tomorrow. You need to decide how far you're willing to go. Emily stared at it for a long moment. Then she made up her mind. Chapter 5. Choosing the battlefield. The moment Emily walked into the meeting, she knew something was different. Daniel was waiting for her in a quiet cafe in Old Montreal, a place too inconspicuous for a high-level government leak. He looked more tired than last time, like the weight of what he was about to say had been gnawing at him for days. She sat down across from him, gripping her coffee cup.
All right, Daniel, talk.
He didn't mince words.
The U.S. is done waiting, he said. They've escalated.
Emily frowned. Escalated how?
Daniel exhaled.
Economic sabotage, covert ops, political blackmail. They're pulling every string they can to weaken Canada before they make a move.
Emily leaned forward. What kind of move?
Daniel hesitated. Then he slid a folder across the table. Emily opened it. Inside were classified reports, leaked intelligence briefings. The words made her stomach tighten. Operation Northern Star, Strategic Stabilization Plan.
They're not just pressuring us, Daniel said. They're laying the groundwork for intervention. They want to destabilize the government, trigger an economic collapse, then step in as peacekeepers to fix the chaos they caused.
Emily's blood ran cold. This is how they do it, Daniel muttered. It's not about tanks or invasions anymore. It's about control.
Emily took a slow breath. How long do we have?
Months, Daniel said.
She swallowed the rising panic. And what's Ottawa doing about it?
Daniel snorted. Nothing. The government is split. Half of them think this is fear-mongering. The other half is terrified but too paralyzed to act. Some are even considering negotiating with Washington. Emily's pulse pounded. Negotiating? Daniel leaned in.
You need to decide, Emily. If you fight this, you're going to war. Not just political war, real war. Are you ready for that?
She held his gaze.
Yes.
Noah's speech. While Emily was learning just how bad things were, Noah Whitefeather was preparing for the biggest speech of his life. His arrest had turned him into a symbol, and Maple Resolve needed that symbol now more than ever. The stage was set in Winnipeg. Over 50,000 people had gathered, workers, students, Indigenous leaders, environmentalists, and everyday Canadians who were tired of being pushed around. Noah stood before them, the cold prairie wind cutting through his coat. But he wasn't cold, not tonight. He took a deep breath, then spoke.
They want us to believe we're weak.
The crowd went silent.
They want us to believe we can't survive without them, that we need them, That our land, our industries, our culture, our identity, none of it means anything unless America says it does.
A murmur spread through the crowd. Noah raised his voice.
But they're wrong.
Applause.
They don't see the Canada that I see. A Canada built on resistance, on ingenuity. A Canada that survived colonialism, economic crises, global wars, and never gave up.
The cheers grew louder.
They think they can buy us, break us, divide us, but they don't understand who they're dealing with. Noah's hands curled into fists. We are Canada, and we don't fucking fold. The crowd erupted. In that moment, Emily knew this wasn't just a protest anymore. This was a revolution.
The general strike, inspired by Noah's speech, Maple Resolve made its boldest move yet, a nationwide general strike. For the first time in modern Canadian history, workers, farmers, teachers, factory employees, even government workers pledged to shut everything down until Ottawa took a stand against US interference. The announcement sent shockwaves through the country. Corporate executives panicked. American investors pulled back. The Canadian dollar fluctuated. And Washington? Washington was furious. The White House issued a statement calling the strike a reckless act of economic sabotage. Conservative politicians labeled Maple Resolve as domestic terrorists. And then the threats started. Employers threatened to fire striking workers. Some provinces tried to outlaw the strike altogether. Police forces were mobilized to break up protests. But it didn't work. People were angry, and for once, that anger was pointed in the right direction. Washington hits back. As the strike loomed, something big happened. The Canadian banking system was hit by a massive cyber attack. ATM networks crashed. Digital transactions froze. Government servers went offline. Panic spread fast. Businesses shut down. People couldn't access their money. The stock market plunged. The media called it a technical failure.
This was an attack.
Omar said, his fingers flying across his keyboard. I don't have proof yet, but I'd bet everything this came from the US.
Emily's phone rang.
Daniel, they're escalating, he said, and if you don't stop this strike, they'll push harder.
Emily clenched her jaw. We're not stopping.
Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The morning of the general strike, Canada ground to a halt. Factories stood silent. Schools closed. Public transportation stopped. Even government workers refused to report in. For the first time in modern history, the country had shut itself down. Emily stood on a rooftop in downtown Toronto, watching the streets below. Normally at this hour, the city would be a hive of movement, cars rushing past, people cramming into subway stations, construction workers hammering away at new developments. But now it was eerie. People had gathered in the streets, waving Canadian flags, holding banners with messages like, Canada stands united. We choose sovereignty, not submission. No to the 51st star. It should have felt victorious. Instead, Emily felt the weight of what was coming. She turned to Noah, who stood beside her, arms crossed. They won't let this last, she murmured.
Noah nodded grimly. No, they won't.
The US response, end this now. The strike sent Washington into a full-blown panic. With trade at a standstill, supply chains disrupted, and investors pulling out, the economic pressure was backfiring. Instead of forcing Canada to submit, it was making America bleed. The White House issued a direct warning to Prime Minister Benoit Lefebvre, shut this strike down, or we will. But Lefebvre was trapped. His cabinet was deeply divided. Some wanted to negotiate with the US. Others wanted to take a hard stance, but they knew the risk. If they're fused, Washington would escalate. And they did. That evening, American media ran a special report. Breaking, intelligence sources suggest foreign actors are behind the Canadian general strike, fueling unrest to destabilize North America. The implication was obvious. They were setting the stage for intervention. Emily's phone buzzed. It was Daniel. She picked up.
Tell me you have good news.
I don't, he said. I have a leak.
Emily stiffened. What kind of leak?
Daniel hesitated. Then he said, the US is considering military action.
Emily's stomach dropped. Military action? She repeated, as in
possible peacekeeping forces entering Canada under the pretense of stabilizing the situation.
Emily felt her pulse hammer in her ears.
That's an invasion.
Daniel's voice was grim. Not if your own government lets it happen.
Emily closed her eyes. This was it. The moment she had feared. The US wasn't just pressuring Canada anymore. They were ready to take it, and Ottawa might let them. The betrayal. Later that night, Maple Resolve received its first real blow. Sophie Tremblay, their key ally from Quebec, burst into Emily's safe house, her face red with fury.
They sold us out, she spat.
Emily's heart clenched. Who?
Sophie slammed her phone onto the table.
The Prime Minister. Lefebvre is in talks with Washington to restore order.
Emily's breath caught.
That coward.
He's saying he'll negotiate, Sophie said. But we know what that means. He's going to give them something. Emily's mind raced. If Lefebvre caved, the US wouldn't need to invade. They'd walk in through the front door. The first clash. The breaking point came the next morning. In Vancouver, a massive demonstration had taken over the streets, blocking major trade routes. Police had been holding back until orders changed. Suddenly, riot squads moved in, violently. Tear gas filled the air. Protesters were clubbed to the ground. Hundreds were arrested. And then it got worse. In Windsor, Ontario, at the Ambassador Bridge, the key crossing between Canada and the US, things exploded. A convoy of Canadian truckers had blockaded the border, refusing to let American goods in or out. It was a bold move, one that hit the US economy hard. But the Americans? They weren't playing games anymore. A group of armed US federal agents crossed into Canadian territory, claiming they were there to escort American goods safely through the blockade. It was illegal, it was unprecedented, and it was intentional. The first real act of aggression. Canadian protesters stood their ground, and then, a gunshot. No one knew who fired first, but by the time the smoke cleared, 2 Canadians were dead. War or surrender. Emily was staring at the screen in disbelief when Omar burst into the room.
Holy shit, he was out of breath. They shot us.
Emily's hands trembled as she turned up the volume. News stations were scrambling to control the narrative. American outlets calling it self-defense. Canadian outlets calling it murder. And Ottawa? Silence. The government was paralyzed, but Maple Resolve wasn't. Emily turned to Noah, Sophie, and the others. They fired the first shot, she said. Now we have to decide, do we back down?
Noah met her gaze.
Sophie nodded. Then what's the plan? Emily exhaled, we fight.
Chapter 7. Canada's Stand. Emily Tran had always believed that battles were won with strategy, not brute force. But now, as she stared at the headlines splashed across every news channel, she realized something terrifying. US agents opened fire at Canadian border. 2 dead. This wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about survival. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, messages from allies, journalists, political figures, all demanding answers. Noah stood beside her, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. Sophie paced, her hands shaking with fury.
This is it, Noah murmured. This is where we make our stand.
Emily nodded slowly. We don't have a choice.
Maple Resolve had always been about resistance, but now it was about defiance. The largest protest in Canadian history. If Washington wanted to break Canada, they would have to do it in front of the entire world. Within 24 hours, Maple Resolve had organized the largest protest in Canadian history. From St. John's to Vancouver, millions of Canadians flooded the streets, waving flags, holding signs, chanting in both English and French. The sheer size of it was staggering. Ottawa, Parliament Hill, was completely surrounded. Montreal, a human chain stretched for kilometers. Toronto, protesters filled Nathan Phillips Square, Yonge Dundas, even the CN Tower grounds. Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Halifax, every city, every town, every reserve had boots on the ground. Even in the US, Canadians living abroad marched in solidarity. Emily stood on a makeshift stage in Toronto, staring out at the sea of people. She had one shot, one moment to ignite the fire. She gripped the microphone and took a breath.
They shot us.
The crowd roared in anger.
They crossed our border. They spilled Canadian blood. And now they expect us to bow?
No, the crowd thundered.
Emily clenched her fist. Washington thinks we'll break, they think we'll fold, but we don't kneel to bullies, we don't surrender to threats, we are Canadians.
The eruption of cheers was deafening. Emily's voice rose.
We are the true North, strong and free. We built this country with our hands, our sweat, our blood, and we will never let them take it from us.
Noah took the mic next, his voice booming. They call us radicals, traitors, separatists.
He let the words hang for a moment. Then he grinned.
If refusing to be owned makes me a radical, then fine, I am a radical. If protecting my land, my people, my country makes me a traitor, then I am a traitor.
The crowd erupted. Emily could feel it. The tide was shifting. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was power. The government is forced to pick a side. The protests pushed Ottawa to the breaking point. Prime Minister Benoit Lefebvre had two choices: condemn Maple Resolve and let the US tighten its grip, stand with the people and risk war. For 3 days, the government stalled. Then, at 8 p.m., Lefebvre finally addressed the nation. The entire country held its breath. He looked into the camera, hands folded, voice steady.
Canada has always been a nation of peace, but peace cannot come at the cost of sovereignty.
The tension crackled.
Let me be clear. Canada will not and will never submit to foreign rule.
The country erupted. Emily exhaled slowly. They had won the public. Now they had to survive the aftermath. The US reacts. The White House was furious. Lefebvre's speech was a direct challenge to Washington's power play. Within hours, US news outlets declared Canada a rogue state. Fox News ran the headline, "Canada descends into anarchy. Does the US have a duty to intervene?" US politicians started pushing for military stabilization. The first American troops were spotted near the border. And then, the shocking international twist. An unexpected ally. That night, Emily's secure line rang. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't an ally. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A voice spoke in French-accented English.
Miss Tran, you don't know me, but my name is Minister François Marchand.
Emily's heart stopped. Minister Marchand was France's foreign minister. Why was France calling her?
Marchand continued, the world is watching. What the United States is doing is unacceptable.
Emily's pulse pounded. Was France offering support?
Marchand spoke carefully. You are not alone.
Emily's breath hitched. Are you saying...
Marchand cut her off. I am saying that if Washington moves against you, there will be consequences.
The call ended. Emily stared at the screen. France was watching, and they weren't the only ones. The final battle begins. The next morning, a US military convoy moved toward the border. They were testing Canada's resolve. Emily, Noah, and the leaders of Maple Resolve gathered for the final decision. It was time to choose. Would Canada stand down or fight? Emily looked around the room, her heart pounding. Then she spoke.
We hold the line.
The battle for Canada's future was about to begin. Chapter 8. The Last Stand. The tension at the border was thick enough to cut with a knife. On one side, a US military convoy, dozens of armored vehicles, helicopters circling above, troops lined up in full combat gear. On the other, a hastily assembled force of Canadian soldiers, Indigenous land defenders, ex-military volunteers, and everyday citizens who had sworn not to let their country fall. Noah Whitefeather stood at the front, his breath visible in the freezing air. The smell of damp earth and gasoline mixed with the sound of distant sirens and the low hum of engines. Emily stood beside him, radio in one hand, scanning the scene. They had planned for this moment. But planning and facing it head-on were two very different things. The international response hours before, the world had watched in silence. Now, they were speaking. After France's warning, more nations broke their silence. Germany condemned the US aggression. The United Nations called an emergency session. Even the UK, America's closest ally, urged caution. But the biggest shock came from China. Their government issued a rare and forceful statement. Any foreign occupation of Canadian territory will be seen as an act of aggression. Emily stared at the screen in disbelief.
Holy shit, Sophie muttered. Are we about to cause World War III?
Emily swallowed hard. I don't know.
But one thing was clear. The world was watching, and Washington wasn't backing down. The standoff at the border. At the Ambassador Bridge, the US military commander stepped forward. A megaphone crackled.
This is your last chance. Stand down or we will use force.
Noah glanced at Emily. We holding the line? Emily took a deep breath.
The battle for Canada. The gunfire erupted like a thunderstorm. Canadian forces hit the dirt, returning fire as the first wave of US troops surged forward. The battle was on. Across the border, skirmishes broke out in multiple locations. Vancouver, protesters clashed with US agents attempting to push through Pacific crossings. Quebec, a militia group blocked bridges leading south, refusing to let US forces advance. New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, fishing communities cut off American naval access. It was Canada's darkest hour, and yet it was fighting back. Emily's desperate gambit back in Toronto. Emily was on the phone with Prime Minister Lefebvre. Call NATO, now, she demanded. Lefebvre hesitated. If I do that, they are attacking us, Benoit. If you don't, this country is done. The Prime Minister closed his eyes. Then he made the call. Canada is invoking Article 5. The room froze. It was the nuclear option. Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the rule that an attack on one member was an attack on all. If NATO agreed, then the US had just started a war with the entire alliance. Emily's hands trembled. This was either Canada's salvation or the moment that lit the world on fire. The White House's dilemma. The moment NATO received the call, Washington went into crisis mode. The Pentagon scrambled. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had banked on Canada being alone. Now they were staring down an international war. The president, surrounded by generals and advisors, was given two options. Double down. Occupy key Canadian regions before NATO could react. Retreat. Save face by claiming a diplomatic resolution. For the first time, the White House hesitated, and that hesitation cost them everything. Canada wins the day. At the border, the first sign of retreat came when US helicopters abruptly turned back. Noah saw it first. He grabbed his radio. They're pulling out. Emily didn't dare believe it. Then, a US military transport flashed its lights twice, a silent message. Stand down. We're leaving. And just like that, the invasion was over. The aftermath. The next morning, the US officially withdrew its troops. President Trump, furious but out of options, gave a rambling, face-saving speech about how Canada had always been a great ally, and that this was just a misunderstanding. But the world knew the truth. Canada had stood its ground, and won. Emily and Noah's legacy. Months later, as the dust settled, Emily and Noah sat on a quiet lakeshore in Ontario, watching the sunrise. Canada had changed. The economy was rebuilding, stronger, more independent than ever. Maple Resolve had become a movement bigger than itself. The world had a new respect for Canada's strength. And Emily? She finally let herself breathe. Noah grinned. We did it. Emily smiled. Yeah, we did. They clinked their coffee mugs together. The battle for Canada's soul was over, and Canada had won. Epilogue, a nation reborn. A year later, a new Prime Minister stood before a roaring crowd in Ottawa. They raised a new flag, a symbol of unity, and the words they spoke, "We are Canada, strong, free, and we bow to no one." The world cheered, and in the pages of history, one name would always be remembered. Maple Resolve, the end.